Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're joining Ken Wytsma, founder of the Justice Conference and president of Kilns College. He's also the author of Pursuing Justice, The Grand Paradox, and Create versus Copy. He and his wife, Tamara, have 4 daughters and live in Bend, Oregon, and the author of the newly released book, The Myth of Equality, Uncovering the Roots of Injustice and Privilege. Ken, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Ken, we find that your writing style, your delivery style is unique because you are, may I state it, you are Caucasian. And this myth of equality has become a Black Lives Matter, the voice of persecution, where the real facts of history don't even support the current narrative that the average American has no historical foundational knowledge given to them in elementary or middle or high school that is factual in regards to things like slavery or discrimination or equality, not only here in America, but throughout the world. But yet, race and this myth of equality have become, if all else fails, play the card. How did you take on this mantle?
Yeah, it's one that comes over time, doesn't it? And you grow into the things that you think about and then write about based on life experience, relationships, and just our own walk of faith and as God leads us. But justice has always been a big issue for me. My dad was an immigrant from Holland. I was born in World War II. Without that war, I wouldn't be here. But he came when he was about 8 years old. My grandfather had been hiding under the stairs during the war, rode a bike 20 miles, dressed up as a woman to find food for the family when my grandma was too pregnant to go and do that. And so my dad, as an immigrant in this country, when I was 8 years old, took a Cambodian family of 5, so a husband, wife, and a baby, and then a brother and sister. And this is in 78, 79, who had been some of the last to flee the genocide in Cambodia to a Thai refugee camp. And he sponsored them to come over, and they lived in our house for a number of years. And then I watched as my parents on the weekends would help them learn how to drive, learn how to speak English, find a job, go through the naturalization process. So justice is something that I think has been deep for me just through that life experience. And when my faith came alive at age 22, it was those passages, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, the alien, the stranger, that really jumped out at me. So the quick story of my later life was going and getting a degree in philosophy and ethics so I could study justice, starting a church where I wanted to try and bridge that gap between the liberal and conservative extremes. John Stott called the last 100 years in America for evangelicals the Great Reversal, where we'd been involved in a lot of things like orphanages and hospitals and compassion works, but for much of the 1900s had lost that, kind of in that extreme kind of polarization with the liberal church. And so I was trying to return to what I thought was a biblical holistic Christianity from the New Testament, from the Old Testament. What is the heart of God for his people? And so planted a church. We started a conference that grew a lot bigger than what we thought it would be. It's now in 6 countries. And in the process of doing that Justice Conference, began to realize that my understanding of justice was really limited to My experience as a white man growing up in this country, even coming from an immigrant background or first generation Christian background, and as developed deeper friendships with people of color, of different races, beginning to learn and understand the challenges that they were going through, and realizing certainly that there's a lot of misinformation all around it, but at the core, that the history of racial injustice in the modern world for the last 500 years has been a significant thing, that it's been propped up in most places by the church, and that this was something I wanted to try and speak into and to try and hopefully bring some clarity to. And so that's where the book came from. I was approached by University Press, and they were looking for an evangelical with conservative theology to be able to speak to some of these issues, because we do tend to grade out people if they're liberal or if they're a minority. Well, obviously they've got kind of their opinion, and we shut it down. So as an evangelical wanting to talk to this, that maybe I could get a conversation going with people.
You know, it's very interesting that we launched this program in January this year, and one of the first couple of weeks I was reflecting back on one of the debates during the presidential election, and in a debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, there was a reference to a term that struck me odd, and the term was the black church.
Mm-hmm.
And I went on to make comments during some of my commentary that, you know, I come from the Jewish world. I came to faith in my mid-40s, and I was born in a synagogue life. I've lived a synagogue life, and I preach in a synagogue life. I just preach Jesus in a synagogue life in this Jewish context. And I didn't understand. I thought that this was a dividing line. It was something that was being established that unfortunately we were perpetuating even at the highest level in the United States by calling a group the black church, as if they were not a part of the church. And so I went out and found the head of the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum, several significant ministers who clearly were leaders of the black church, and had them come in and sit in this studio and school me.
Yeah.
Because I was completely ignorant. I said, you know, what? We're so scattered, so divided, and explained to me the role that the black church played in the community, and therefore it needed an identity. It needed to be a nucleus. It needed to be a fountain of light that could be readily identified. And my head was spinning. I was hearing things that were my logical mind couldn't ever conceive of, because I didn't live in that world, but yet with that identity they were able to serve their community. They became a safe haven. It was an identity to be gravitated to. And I began to realize that what I thought was discriminatory and almost anti-white was a necessity. It was at the core of the community. And then I began to look to see, all right, if that's held together one nation of people across Watts, across Harlem, across Detroit, across downtown poor Birmingham, Alabama, have we created dividing lines or called them barriers when actually they are bridges? They're planks on a bridge.
Yeah, I mean, what you're bringing up is a fascinating thing, and I think that you can say with black colleges the same thing. that they get pushed back on pretty quickly as being racist, or started an all-white school and called it a white school. And I think the thing that helps with that, certainly has for me over the years, is to put the word historic in front of it. The historic black church, black colleges. Slaves were allowed to do church in the South. And whenever you have an oppressed class of people, they bond together up in some deeply spiritual ways. You mentioned your Jewish background, and this would be similar. And it forges an identity of people that have sustained or endured or found a way despite the persecution. And so that historic black church that has existed in America for hundreds of years is a part of the history. It's the identity, the nobility of people that were a persecuted class, and is oftentimes, contrary to the suburban church, done a lot of community development work that's needed in this country, that doesn't quite exist in the same way in maybe more affluent areas. The historic black colleges existed because they weren't allowed, black students were not allowed to go to white college. So it's not that we have these things called black colleges, geez, what if we called colleges white colleges? The reality is we called all colleges white colleges,
right,
in the segregated South. And so colleges were an opportunity for students, young men and women of color, to be able to go to school. And these schools endured persecution, sold property. In Atlanta, you have 4 of them that share borders. They all came in one area of town to kind of have one large campus, if you will, cobbled together because it was safer. So you're talking about schools that existed and are, again, a mark of the pride of a people that suffered for a long time under oppression. And so these aren't black schools that started 10 years ago. These are historic black colleges and universities that were such because of the federal discrimination that existed in this country, propped up mainly by Christians. There's just no way of getting around that. So it is like you're saying, an opportunity for us to learn that some dividing lines aren't there as a new creation to divide people. They're there actually to hold a group of people together, and it's not there to say anything about in a kind of a racial or specific way. The black church isn't making a value statement on white people. It's an identity statement for those communities.
Well, what's happened is, and we've watched this, are the talking heads that are the go-to source in any matter that are representing injustice and privilege and feeling that you have to establish that Black Lives Matter, you have to establish that this group matters. As a believer, all people matter. It's foundational truth of the Bible. All were created in the image of God, therefore we're all God's children. We're all related. We're all connected. We're all a part of a larger than ourselves. But deep down inside, it's a myth. It's a myth on both sides. There's a myth of equality and there's a myth of inequality. God called one man, Abraham, out of a people of idol makers to be different. And in reality, all of us who, whether we're traditionally Jewish or believers in Jesus, enter into that body of people birthed, that nation birthed out of one person set apart. And the issues that we face police matters, crime, drug trafficking, gang activity. These are not based on equality or inequality. These are colorblind. An opioid doesn't know whether or not you're white or black. A chunk of crack cocaine does not know whether or not you are white or black.
No, I agree. I just to roll a couple pieces out. I think the Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter thing is, one of the best illustrations is if you showed up at a breast cancer marathon. You got 10,000 people that are wearing pink and they're about to run a marathon or a 10K to raise money for breast cancer. And right before they click the gun to start on the 10K, somebody jumps out in front of that mass of people and starts yelling at them and saying, all cancer matters. What are you guys doing here? You're being discriminatory. If I'm talking to one of my daughters, I have 4 daughters. If I'm talking to one of my daughters that really had a bad day and was bullied or ran into very difficult situations with other people, and I've got her in my lap and I'm telling her I love you, and my other daughter jumps in and says, but Dad, don't you love us all? The answer is, well, yeah, of course, but right now I'm talking to this daughter. And so I think you're right. Opioids, bullets don't know color, but interestingly enough, when Airbnb just redid their policies for discrimination, it was because not because white Anglo-Saxon names were being discriminated against. It's because minority-sounding names were being discriminated against, and the same thing that you can say with the number of people pulled over in a city, in our city, the rates of people that are pulled over if you're a person of color. So I mean, there's a reality that exists that the large body of that movement, and it's a diffuse movement. It's millions of people using a hashtag, if you will. Right. Certainly, there's pockets that are more activist and wanting to train, but in large, it's simply saying, in this country for a long period of time, the loss of life or the incarceration of life of black bodies has not registered as loudly in the community as the incarceration or the loss of life by a white body. And the examples of some of the rape cases at Stanford and other places where mug shots aren't released of a 20-year-old co-ed because it might harm his future job prospects. Whereas, you would regularly see a mug shot being released with a low-income person of color, kind of confirming, that there's violence in the inner city. So there's just a lot of these subtle things. Last night, I was with 2 African-American friends and a woman colleague. And we went to 2 different places, appetizers for one place and dinner for another. And I wasn't paying at either place. And every single time the bill was put in front of me. It can be as subtle as that and to as large as how a jury reacts to somebody in front of them. But the racial realities of this country, the socialization that we've had through movies, most of the romantic comedies I still see, and all of the ones I saw growing up have a white woman and a white man as the lovely couple that you see yourself being, and only then there's the funny friend that's kind of on the side. So there's this reality that it has been the dominant race, the desirable race in our marketing, our messaging. There wasn't even a black person till I think it was the 70s that showed up in a commercial brushing their teeth. I've talked to friends that are like, I know black people brush their teeth, but you never saw it in a commercial until the 70s onward. So some of these things just are a part of our history. And when you add those things up, like you bringing on those friends and having them sit next to you, there's something so beautiful when we learn the story of the other. Like you're saying, we're all made in the image of God. We all have worth. And as we learn and listen to each other, we can develop a better, more nuanced understanding of what it would look like for Christ in me to come out and be what interacts with the world. Not just maybe the way I was socialized or how I was taught in this grade or that grade by this teacher or that teacher, but it's Christ in me that encounters people.
Amen. We're talking with Ken Wytsma, author of The Myth of Equality, Uncovering the Roots of Injustice and Privilege. We're having an honest dialogue that traditional media is afraid to take on, that there has been and continues to be a bias in this country, and it's now increased to include Hispanic into the equation to the same degree as there has been an imbalance in the African American community. When we come back, we're going to take a look at the book and how we, two white guys that have a voice, can impact perception, narrative, and change by following the words of the Messiah, not the words of Reverend Ike or Jesse Jackson or Malcolm X or any voice other than the one voice that we're called to listen to, and that is the voice of the Lord. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're visiting with Ken Wytsma, author of The Myth of Equality, Uncovering the Roots of Injustice and Privilege. We're talking about the taboo subjects that people just aren't willing to have open dialogue. And during the break, I made a point to Ken to say, you know, God is the author of discrimination. God is the author of separation. He took Abraham from a family of idol worshippers and turned him into a monotheist and said to him and his descendants, you're to have nothing to do with these people. You're to not intermarry. You're to have nothing to do with them. We would call that blatant discrimination. We would say that the people groups that he listed, that God was racist, saying, don't marry the Edomites, don't marry the Amalekites, don't marry. But that wasn't his message at all. His message is, yes, you are to be discriminatory. You are to choose me over evil. You are to reject evil. Evil has no color. Evil has no race. It has no foundation other than the pit of hell. And therefore, I'm raising you to be a discerning, discriminating people, and I'm telling you what to choose. We as men have watered that down to, we as believers don't even have affinity and unity with fellow believers who believe in the exact same Messiah we believe in, but we will shun them because of their color, their accent, or their point of origin. So Jesus says a house divided against itself cannot stand. How can we, America as a nation, say we're 72% Christian and demonstrate the amount of racism and inequality that exists within our own culture?
Yeah, there's a propensity we have to put ourselves in the good guy category and then put people on the other side of the line, draw a line in the sand, and then the people on the other side of the line are the bad guys. And so like you said, not to withdraw from people to keep pure in the Old Testament, a belief in God and obedience to God, but actually to draw out and judge or hate or even do harm to the other. There's something about that line in the sand. And I think when Jesus had the woman caught in adultery thrown at his feet, and he turned it back around and said, who of you here is without sin? And then when he went to the Pharisees that thought they were so pure, they were the good guys, and the others on the other side of the line, and he uses the Samaritan to teach them about what he's really looking for in terms of a heart of love. I think Solzhenitsyn, the Russian novelist, said it best, that the line between good and evil doesn't actually exist out there. It exists right through the human heart of every person. And when we realize that we're both a sinner and maybe, if we're lucky, a little bit of saint, and that the other person, regardless of color or creed, is also a complex and messy individual, then we can have grace. We can have fellowship. We can believe different than they do, but we can still treat them with dignity as made in the image of God. Common grace, the rain falls on the righteous and the wicked alike. All of creation is still bearing the marks of God. And so when I look at somebody, they could be a future brother or sister in Christ. Jesus says, love your enemy, which means I got to look at every enemy as a potential future friend. That's earth-shaking with regard to this line in the sand that puts me on the good side and others on the bad side. And I think in America we've had a small gospel about individualistic salvation, that it's just me and God, and that's really all that matters, or that Jesus came to save me, and then we just full stop. And when we put the gospel in a box, I don't think we should be surprised to see that we have compartmentalization in the rest of our faith. And so back in the age of Jim Crow in the South, you'd have a deacon take part in a lynching on a Friday night, and then on a Sunday morning preach the sermon in church and not really see the disconnect there. So when our gospel's put in a box, I think the rest of our faith follows. And that's what we're really trying to tear down, is that we might call ourselves Christian by creed or by ritual or by affiliation. But to be Christ followers really means that we are living a life of love, that we are looking at others and not seeing through eyes of fear, but we're seeing through eyes of faith. We're not judging them as if we were in their shoes, but rather we're trying to understand who they are and the road that they've walked in their shoes. Because when we understand how people got to where they are, or what the forces are or factors are in their life, then there's a lot greater chance for us to have grace with that. So that's why the first whole section of that book, The Myth of Equality, was really diving into the history of race in America that most people don't understand, because it shapes the map today, it shapes our experience today, it shapes the ways that we don't really understand each other today. And I think sometimes having our understanding of history toggled a bit, or a little bit of a dissonant piece come into it, it opens us up to begin to listen. And that's the beginning of everything, is it not?
It is. I think the first clarion call is that as a disciple of Messiah, we are called to care. Period. We are to go from an uncaring, self-serving individual to someone who cares about the needs of others. I find it equally interesting that God has used the things of the outward to present us great opportunity for the advancement of the gospel, and we have used it as great opportunity to exercise fatal discrimination. And the best example is someone wears a hijab, and we fear them as an enemy. And I look at them and say, you're wearing a garment that has a bright neon sign on it that says, I need Jesus. I don't know the gospel. You see two men holding hands walking down the street, and you look at it and you're appalled at this overt homosexual behavior. And I see a neon sign that says, I don't know Jesus. I don't have a relationship with the Lord. I need the gospel. If you and I were to meet together on the street You and I wear no sign. You wouldn't know that I was an observant Jew when I came to faith. You can't tell that. But we can tell the Hindu. We can tell the Shinto. We can tell the Muslim. We can tell, in many cases, the homosexual. We can tell. And these are opportunities, and we miss the mark completely by not ministering to them, but by reversing that, by making it a dialogue of rejectionism as opposed to an opportunity of salvation.
Jesus healed people, and they walked away and went to present themselves as clean or not, and some of them came back, but not all.
Right.
And what I learned from that is that we're to love indiscriminately. We're to love not based on what other people might do, whether they're deserving or not. We're supposed to be, in the words of a friend who does an organization in Iraq, we're supposed to have preemptive love that goes first. I think when you saw some of the retribution murders or hate crimes against Sikhs after 9/11,
yes,
Sikhs coming from India wearing turbans, but being very different than the faith or even the belief systems of fundamentalists coming out of Saudi Arabia and being involved in the 9/11 terrorist acts. Yet our level of ignorance of mistaking those groups it just shows the degree to which our actions can discriminate without even the benefit of knowledge. And so I'm a believer in education. You're a pastor and a rabbi. I'm a pastor and a teacher. I believe in the value of education, that when we grow in knowledge, discernment, wisdom, our ability to understand how God would have us act in this world grows. The fear of the Lord, says the book of Proverbs, is the beginning of wisdom. That means when we take God into account first, it's going to shape our actions in society. And I think that a lot of the debate around race is simply because we grow up in segregated communities and we lack knowledge of the history and the experience and sometimes the humanity of the other. And so education, dialogue, I appreciate this opportunity to go deeper into this subject. It's only going to be helpful if we're using words of truth and love and not trying to be purveyors of misinformation.
You, in your book, in chapter 6, does justice belong in our gospel conversation? You quote St. Augustine. If you believe what you like in the Gospels and reject what you don't like, it's not the gospel you believe, but yourself. And you share a story about an encounter you had. I'd like you to share that story because it answers the question, does justice belong in our gospel conversation?
Which story? Just give me a quick bit.
Well, you're there at a meeting on the 13th floor of a New York high-rise with Christian African-American leaders. And the topic of religious rights and decline in the many sectors was debated.
So this was a group. Yeah, this was a group of pastors, and we were at a very conservative, the offices of Redeemer in New York City, which is connected to Tim Keller. It wasn't their ministry. I think they were just providing the space for this group to meet. But it was a whole room full of predominantly African-American pastors and ministers. And we were talking about legislation that had come out in California a year ago that got tabled. But at the time it was alive, and it would have really threatened in colleges that were going to take and put forth an ethical code based on biblical principles that would potentially draw accusations of being discriminatory, and that it would remove the legal protections and the covering for those schools to declare where they stand with regard to some of these issues, how they're going to do their bathrooms, their locker rooms, their dorms. And so there was a lot of angst in California. There's a lot of schools in California: Biola, Westmont, Azusa Pacific, Cal Baptist. You go on and on. There's a lot of Bible colleges in California. And the angst that the pastors and even denominational leaders in the country were feeling about this, wanting to push back on this proposed legislation, they were going to the African American community that has, in many respects, a lot more of a history in politics and in working with politicians and legislation, and asking them to fight with them for the protection of religious liberties. And the interesting thing that I'd never thought of in that room was that this room, although they cared deeply about those issues, said, we've been fighting for civil liberties for our people for decades, if not hundreds of years. And no matter what urgency or angst we've had in our voice, we've never been able to get these Christian causes or some of these denominational leaders, those that are coming and speaking to us, to stand up in any kind of a march or peaceful protest, or to use your influence in the middle-class churches to try and help us promote the full dignity of our people in this society, civil rights and liberties. And they said, so forgive us if we're not feeling your same urgency to jump to this cause when we're in the middle of trying to work with our communities and help out poor people, single moms, formerly incarcerated, what have you. And it was really interesting. It just showed me that you have two different communities that grab onto rights, a different set of rights, at a different level. And arguably, the white church, or the evangelical church I've been a part of, has been blind for a long time to the necessity or the urgency of the civil rights call from the African American church or the historic black church. And that's kind of what I mean by who was it that was creating the racist laws in American society up until the Civil War? Who was it in the South that was promulgating Jim Crow and segregation? It was judges who were Christian. It was pastors who were Christian. It was lawmakers who were Christian. There was legislation introduced for almost all of Jim Crow to try and make lynching a federal crime so that it could actually be prosecuted. No one ever went to jail for murder in any lynching in the South, and only a few people actually served jail time at all. It was oftentimes just completely wiped off the map, and shoulders shrugged as kind of a mob violence, and nobody was really held accountable. And all of the introduction of law at the federal level was shot down by powerful blocks of Southern senators, many of whom were Christian and serving Christian voting blocks. So it's just a complicated history. When people ask me, Ken, what do we do, especially if there are white people coming in and saying, how do we fix this problem? That's why at the end of the book I say the first thing we have to do is listen and then lament. Because if you're someone who lost a great-granddaddy or an uncle to racial violence, there's no fix right away to that. There's only a complicated and traumatic history of your family that lost a loved one to violence, and because of that fled the South as refugees to try and find work in the promised land in some of these northern cities where you weren't received by northern communities that had race riots to try and keep you out. So when we get to this, type A American, let's fix it, I think sometimes it's important that we slow down and first understand the story and the trauma that many communities in the United States have felt and continue to feel.
You bring clarity in the first part of the book into the history of it, which opens up some avenues that others have not in looking at the truth of the situation. There are those that want to perpetuate a division because it advances excuse me, a Democratic Republican divide, party-wide, looking to create a political influence, a political infrastructure that serves their needs in leadership. But they don't set the tone in the pew. They don't set the tone in Walmart. They don't set the tone in the grocery line. They don't set the tone. We set the tone. We set the tone when we help load the groceries. We set the tone when we stop by and have a conversation. We set the tone when we offer the smile, the extended hand. We were called to be hands and feet of Messiah, not discriminators. And if we as the body acted like the body of Christ, the ones who are advancing on both sides of this equation would be, the microphone would be taken out of their hand.
I think we run into problems anytime, right? When we deal with the macro or big generalizations, and we miss the people, the individuals, human lives, that man, that woman, that child, that doesn't necessarily fit our stereotyping, right? And so we all do it, all sides do it, certainly in a hostile political climate. And so I think two things are helpful, and it's kind of what I remember. Stephen Covey, most people are familiar with his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yes.
But I read it as a teenager, and the seek first to understand and then to be understood has seemed like one of the most kind of straightforward principles of wisdom and love and grace that I've run across. So seek first to understand that immigrant or undocumented person's story, or that refugee story, or for me sometimes even that middle-class white man who's very much struggling and having a hard time and isn't in a place where that person feels ready to have a conversation about others and their experience, but trying to understand that. And then secondly, just to bring it back to your question, does justice belong in our gospel conversation? Isaiah 59, God looks and sees that there is no justice. He's appalled that there's no one to intervene. So his own arm, the incarnation, his own arm works salvation for him, and his righteousness sustains him. And so you have salvation, righteousness, justice, all of this wrapped up in the good news of Jesus coming, the incarnation. So when someone argues with me and says justice is a liberal thing, it's a social gospel thing, it's good works, it doesn't belong in the gospel conversation, I usually will be a bit facetious with them and say, okay, I think I understand what you're saying about the gospel. Let me repeat it to you, and then you tell me if I'm understanding you correctly. And this is in the book, but I'll say, so Jesus came so that unjust people could stand next to a just God, as if we're just, through a process of justification whereby we're justified.
Right.
But that has nothing to do with justice. It has everything to do with righteousness. Am I correct? And usually it's hearing all of that justice language that they never really understood or saw and connected back to God's heart for justice. Helps open their eyes a little bit that our gospel isn't so narrowly constricted to just forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins happens so that we can be cleansed and made new in our love of God and love of others. So there's a whole chapter in there that really talks about that the gospel isn't just the forgiveness of sins. Ultimately, the forgiveness of sins is the means to the end of a reconciliation with God. So
Amen.
God is reconciling the world to himself in Christ Jesus and has now given us this ministry of reconciliation. And I think that means we take people the way we find them, with different religions, creeds, or race, or gender, and we start there and go, I'm going to love you because that's what God has put in my heart. We love because he has first loved us.
If salvation was the end all and be all, the moment we said yes to the Lord, we would have been taken up to heaven. He left us here for a reason, to be the hands and feet, and
sir.
understand this. Ken, we've run out of time, but I've so enjoyed this. I encourage those who have a heart to understand the root. Where did it begin? And is it an absolute? And it is an absolute. It is absolutely unbiblical. It is absolutely not conduct becoming of a believer. But in order to understand it, you have to understand that there is a myth of equality, and there are roots of injustice and privilege that go back, that we perpetuate, that we can only affect change one soul at a time. The same way we can for the gospel. It's the same way we were reached. We weren't reached by the millions. We were one person at a time. But many hands, many voices makes for light work. Ken Wytsma, The Myth of Equality, Uncovering the Roots of Injustice and Privilege. If you care about your fellow man, if you care about your community, if it bothers you that there are still racial divides, and you want to know what are we going to do about it, get the book, because it answers the question, what are you going to do about it? Ken, thanks so much for sharing this story with us. We appreciate you being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thanks for having me. God bless.
God bless you. And that brings to an end our live broadcast day, but not our broadcast day, for this station continues to broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we'll be back here in studio live at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Central Time, when we bring you tomorrow's edition of Revealing the Truth. Until we see you right back here, or on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and all of those social media places where we interact with you. And we love to hear your comments. Write to us at info@ignitinganation.com. So until we see you right back here in studio tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Central Time, right here on IANBN.com, we bid you shalom.